Welcome back to our series of lessons on nonverbal communication in intercultural settings. This lesson is brought to you by the University of Languages and International Studies. I hope that you will enjoy it. You might be well informed that nonverbal languages vary in each culture. However, it is also interesting to discover that nonverbal behaviors are universal to some great extent. And that's the topic of today's lesson. At the end of the lesson, we also go through some gestures that teachers should and shouldn't apply on their classroom. Before moving to the details, I want you to think about the two following questions. The first one, what does the universality means? And the second one is, why it is important in cultural communication? You might have your answer now, right? Universality means the fact of being true or right at all times and in all places. In cultural studies, there's nothing absolute like this, but it refers to a generalization of a culture. For example, not all English people are cold and like to talk weather, but a generalized description states that, and it turns out to be a typical image of the English. With the second question, its main function is to provide a general outlines for foreigners to shape appropriate corresponding behaviors. For example, when we know that English people are not willing to talk to foreigners, we shouldn't suddenly approach them. Now we move on to the findings of the research investigating the universality of nonverbal communication. They have focused on 4 areas. The first one, the relationship of humans' behaviors to that of primates, particularly chimpanzees. Number 2, nonverbal communication of sensory-deprived children who are blind or deaf. Number 3, facial expressions. And the last one, universal functions of nonverbal social behavior. The first area, the relationship of humans' behavior to that of primates. Chimpanzees and humans share many nonverbal behaviors. For example, both exhibit the eyebrow flash, a slight raising of the eyebrow that communicates recognition, one of the most basic and universal animals' behaviors. Primates and humans also share some facial expressions, and very recent research reveals another gesture shared by chimps and humans, the upturned palm, meaning "give me." Chimps have been observed using it in the wild and in captivity to ask other chimps to share food, for help in a fight, or to request a grooming session. Now please watch a video called "Like Humans, Chimps Learn Behavior from One Another to Have Better Observation."
Their faces can express complex emotions with a single glance. They yawn when they're tired, laugh when they're having fun, and even kiss to make up after a spat. And just like us, they are endlessly inquisitive. And it's this natural curiosity that has been key to their success. I'm meeting some energetic 4-year-old chimps at a jungle rescue center to set up an exercise that should demonstrate just how smart they really are. Just like us, chimps have different personalities. Some are shy, others show-offs. Some like to take the lead, others are a little more cautious. But perhaps the most extraordinary thing we share with chimps is the ability to learn from each other. To demonstrate, I've set up a test with an unused termite mound that's been filled with honey. The chimps have had to figure out how to get at the honey deep inside. A few super smart chimps first learned that if they could fashion a dipping stick, they could get at the sugary treat. Amazingly, the others watched and learned. Over a few years, this intricate behavior spread through most of the group. One of our boisterous 4-year-olds hasn't quite mastered it yet. So I'm giving him a lesson. It's not looking promising. But after some perseverance,
perfect. He's seen me using that stick to get to the honey, and he's copied it, and that's the process of learning.
the chimpanzee's ability to figure out problems and learn from each other has led to different groups of chimps developing distinct behaviors and skills. These are so unique to different populations that chimps, like humans, are said to have different cultures.
Interesting, right? There do seem to be strong parallels between specific facial expressions and gestures displayed by human and non-human primates, universally interpreted to hold similar meanings. However, it still remains true that communication among non-human primates like chimps and monkeys appears to be less complex than among humans. Move to the second area, nonverbal communication of sensory-deprived children who are blind or deaf. Recent studies compare the facial expressions of children who were blind with those of sighted children and found many similarities. Even though the children who were blind couldn't see the facial expressions of others to mimic them, they still made the same expression. This suggests some innate genetic basis for these behaviors. You could see the same result in the following research called Science Today Facial Expressions.
We can tell how other people are feeling just by looking at them. When someone is happy, they smile. When they are sad, they frown. But where do these facial expressions come from? Are they learned or are they innate? David Matsumoto studied these questions for years in his Culture and Emotion Research Lab at San Francisco State.
Facial expressions are so important because they are part of a nonverbal communication system that we all have that we use extensively when we communicate with others. Facial expressions comment on the words in many different ways so that you know that a person may be joking or they may be very serious. I think this is why we have emoticons in email. Facial expressions are very difficult to study in the lab because when people are in a lab, they're watching what they're doing. And so oftentimes what you get in the laboratory is not what occurs in real life.
David realized there was a better setting to study expressions, the 2004 Summer Olympic Games. It just so happened he was headed there anyway, as a researcher for the International Judo Federation.
And the Olympics is the perfect place to do one of these studies because it's real life, it's naturalistic, it's very emotional.
He then turned his eye and the camera toward the Paralympic Games.
By studying the expressions of the blind athletes in the Paralympic Games, and then comparing them to the expressions of the athletes in the sighted, the regular Olympic Games, we can tell whether they have the same expressions or not.
And the result?
Those who won showed signs of true enjoyment. Those who lost showed sadness or distress or fear or anger. And they were the exact same facial muscle movements that occurred in both the sighted and the blind. They occurred at both exactly the same times in exactly the same ways. And they differentiated winners and losers in exactly the same ways. And so the findings were amazingly similar. So the study of the blind athletes in the Paralympic Games showed us conclusively that the source of facial expressions of emotions must be resident in some innate biological program that we all have, that we're born with, and that we have from birth. And that everybody all around the world, as long as you're a human, has that. And I think that that's a very powerful message that this study shows.
So the next time you see someone smile or frown, remember, you are seeing an expression of their DNA.
Moving to the next areas, facial expression. Indeed, many cross-cultural studies supported the belief of some universality in nonverbal communication, particularly in facial expressions. Several facial gestures seem to be universal, including the eyebrow flash, just described, the nose wrinkle, indicating slight social distancing, and the disgust face, a strong sign of social dislike. It is also possible that grooming behavior is universal, as it is in animals, although it seems to be somewhat prevented in Western societies. Recent findings indicate that at least 6 basic emotions, including happiness, sadness, disgust, fear, anger, and surprise, are communicated by similar facial expressions in most society. Expressions to these emotions are recognized by most cultural groups as having the same meaning. The last area deals with how some nonverbal behaviors fills universal human social needs for promoting social connection or bonding. For example, according to this research, laughter is not just a message about the positive feelings of the sender, but an attempt to influence others, to make them feel more positive toward the sender. Similarly, the social purpose of mimicry, when interaction partners adopt similar posture, gestures, and mannerisms, is to create affective or social bond with others. Researchers point out that peoples in all cultures use these nonverbal behaviors to influence others, and over time, these behaviors that contributed to positive relationship were favored and eventually became automatic and non-conscious. Now, for the second part of this video, I want to give a brief guideline for teachers in using nonverbal language in classroom. Sometimes, it's hard for teachers to notice their gesture while they're in teaching, but these are the few gestures that you should do and shouldn't do to your students. Firstly, you should turn your palm to face the students when you point to something on the board, which shows that you want students to concentrate on the point you are talking about. Secondly, you should use an upturned palm when you ask questions. It shows that you are welcoming students' answers. Thirdly, you should use your thumbs up after listening to student answer to show excellent. And finally, you could high five with your student to show well done or you're great. Something you should notice is that you should never point out to a student's face. That's rude and may hurt your student's feeling. And you should not close your arms and put your hands on your hips like this, because it creates a sense of alienation or danger. And this is the end of our lesson today. I hope that this lesson would be useful for you. Thanks for your attention.